but nothing major change compared to 2012. So if you look at the few slides that are on your screen, as I said, inflation continued to stay tamed. The exchange rate remained stable. I haven't put on the slide, but the reserves continued to strengthen, but not by a significant amount. Generally, around 3 months of imports, which for a country as open or an economy as open as Vietnam is still not that adequate. We also saw the sovereign risk spreads continuing to improve and be more aligned with what we see for other emerging market economies. Oh, sorry, I have the foreign reserves here. Okay. As I said, growth has continued to be sluggish, just inching up a little bit from what happened in 2012. Behind that sluggish growth has been really weak domestic demand. We've seen in 2012 and perhaps more strongly in 2013 as almost like a two-speed economy where the foreign invested sector has done much better and the domestic sector hasn't done as well. The domestic private sector and of course, even more so, the state enterprise sector. And we've seen the drop-off in retail sales reflecting the weak consumer confidence. So weakened business and consumer confidence evidenced in the sluggish growth that we've witnessed. Okay, and then we look at the structural reform side of activity in Vietnam, and we realize there as well that the pace hasn't been as fast as we've all been patiently waiting to see. On the SOE restructuring, we all saw there was no significant progress in equitization. There were 77 SOEs which were equitized. It's very hard to know the details of those equitizations against a planned 500, number of 500 for 2012 to the 2015 period. And we also know that about 55% of state economic groups and general corporations prepared restructuring plans that have been approved by the Prime Minister. The problem with these plans is it's not clear the level of technical expertise that has gone into it and the extent to which they're really plans that will turn things around and make a huge difference in these enterprises. These are basically, to a large extent, plans that have been put forward and put together by the same people that have run these enterprises into a bit of a mess. So. But I think on the good side, there were important decrees and pieces of legislation put in place that hopefully should set the scene for stronger action in 2014. For example, Decree 61 to regulate financial supervision, performance assessment, and disclosure of financial information of SOEs. This was done in June. Decree 71 on investment of state capital in enterprises and financial management of enterprises with 100% charter capital by the state. And I think this would be an effort to tighten budget constraints that SOEs face. And the charters of the biggest state economic groups and general corporations was put in the form of decrees to raise the legal responsibilities and accountability of the board of directors and managers of these large SOEs. We also saw a decree on performance-based remuneration for SOE managers. So all of these are good, and we'll see what happens in 2014. On the banking side, previous speakers have made references to some of what has happened. There were a couple of mergers and acquisitions, as we know, small ones. Again, key legislation, Circular 2 on the loan classification, on which implementation has been put on hold till middle of this year. But if that goes ahead, it will really begin to clarify the level of non-performing loans and give a more accurate picture of the risks in the system in that sense. Decree 53 and Decision 87 on the establishment, organization, and the operation of the Vietnam Asset Management Company. And as we know, they've already bought about 40 trillion dong in bad assets. It's not clear the process of actually really resolving these bad debts that have been acquired by the VMC yet. Decree 156 on organization and operation of the State Bank of Vietnam, which brings some improvement but doesn't go far enough towards creating an independent central bank, but mentions, in addition to the traditional responsibility of providing adequate credit, also responsibilities for managing and assuring good and sound macroeconomic balances or something to that effect. So some small move forward. Um, and then, as Fraser Mark has said, there are several other pieces of legislation, the revised constitution, which again didn't go as far as a lot of people would have wished, but has some good elements of it. The new law on procurement, which in our view is really pushing things forward. It also envisages e-procurement, and if that is done, should really help address some of the issues around transparency and corruption on public contracts, and the work on the corporate income tax as well. Okay, let's take a quick look at some of the underlying trends, stepping back a few years back. And the first thing that I want to say is that, despite all that's going on, the sluggish economy, concerns about whether reforms will happen or not or be accelerated, I think it's clear that the private sector share of the economy is continuing to increase. It might not be rising as fast, but it's steadily going there, and the state sector share is declining. And so you see that on the slide. You also see related to that the private sector share of credit is also going up. I would also just mention the caveat that the way private sector share of credit is mentioned is a bit artificial. It's not really the true private sector because it involves state-owned enterprises that are not 100% owned by the state. So take that with a pinch of salt. But I think the first graph really does show that we're moving in the right direction generally. As has been mentioned already, the trade balance has turned positive, compared to several years back or a few years back where Vietnam had this long-standing negative trade balance. Again, some of it could be artificial because there's a bit of a slump in the economy. Imports are lower because production is highly import intensive. So it's partly the result of that, but we also know that there's been very strong export performance. The trade balance turning positive has also provided a good story on the current account balance, which is now in the order of about 5.4% of GDP. And then there's a shift in export composition, which again has been mentioned, towards more high-tech exports. We've seen with the Samsung investment in Vietnam, and maybe there isn't a lot of value addition happening right now, but I think it's a first step in moving towards hopefully over time building more of the value chain in Vietnam. But that shift in export composition I think is a good trend. And then also, again, has been mentioned, the shift in the composition of FDI commitments. In the past, you had a lot of real estate. And I guess everybody's seen the downsides of that. There's more investment or there's more commitment on the manufacturing side, which is a positive trend. Sorry. Yeah. So the story on that is that, look, in the aggregate, Vietnam is going through some of the worst times in terms of economic, maybe a more private sector oriented economy is continuing to happen. So let's talk about 2014 and what do we see as we enter 2014? All of you here are in some business or other. Business sentiment is mixed. The manufacturing PMI has gone up high. It's the highest recorded numbers since April 2011, but the business confidence is still hovering around the midpoint range. So this is where we're at. And if you look at the data, some of the data that was done by Eurocham on the Vietnam Business Climate Index, talking to businesses, I think in 2012, and seeing a very much smaller number of businesses who are planning new investments, or expanding production in 2012 compared to 5 years before. So this is where we're at. Okay. Now, let's talk about a few questions for 2014 and then try and see what that might mean for the year. Now, will Vietnam stay the course of macro stability? I mean, there was a lot of pressure sometime last year for the state bank or government to abandon monetary and fiscal restraint and to pay more attention to stimulating the economy and to getting growth growing. There was some measures in that direction, but clearly that did not put at risk macro stability. That was maintained. My view is that this will continue in 2014. I think the risks that they will abandon the macro stability objectives are really low. I think it's because over the last 18 months or so, close to 2 years, they've done it, and I think it's paid off. And I think the state bank, or at least the governor's approval rating, seem to be recovering. I think that he's more confident in continuing the policy stance. And if you see the targets that they've set for 2014, inflation of 7%, credit growth of 12 to 14%, all of these head in the direction of continued macro tightening. The fiscal deficit is somewhat challenging. You saw the Prime Minister ask the National Assembly to raise the ceiling on the fiscal deficit, which for 2014 will be 5.3%. And that is a little high and has some implications for longer term debt sustainability for Vietnam. But if you look at the government's medium term financial strategy, the objective is to come down to 4.5% over the medium term. And you see a process of fiscal consolidation still ongoing, with a lot of public investment being cut. In a sense, that's part of the good news story, because 5 years ago, you really had a public investment binge, overspending and to some extent, largely inefficient public investment. And that's gone back a little bit. So it's part of the contraction, fiscal consolidation. But the government is also making an effort to clear out arrears to private sector contractors, which is good. And I think that this requirement or this request for a higher deficit, if we understand correctly, is not seen to continue for a long time. So broadly, our sense is that the macro stability trend or direction will continue. I think the external performance prospects are also good. We see the global economy beginning to recover. The US economy is stronger. The European economies are also coming out much stronger. That provides a good situation for Vietnam, because easily a third of Vietnam's exports go to the US and to the European Union countries. So that should continue to support. We anticipate private remittances will continue to be strong, and FDI inflows, largely Japanese, Korean, or Asian, will also come in. And then let's talk about the structural reforms. How do we see things in 2014? I think generally, as I said, a lot of very good legislation has been passed, pieces of legislation, regulations that could, if implemented, be transformational and really lead Vietnam into the direction of reform, so a better performing state enterprise sector that is desired. So what we see is progress in divesting from the five highly risky non-core activities that state enterprises have been asked to divest from: banking, real estate, insurance, securities, and so on. But we're not likely to see credible progress on any big divestitures. It's partly because it's so complicated. These things take a long time. So in 2014 itself, you're not going to see too much of that. I think one of the things that needs to be mentioned is that the government is amending the decree on equitization to remove the hurdles on some of the hurdles to the process, which includes the requirement to use the book value of the enterprise as the floor price in all these discussions. And that has really been a problem because people thought they would get into trouble if they were seen as selling of state assets at lower than book value. So that is being removed, and that should contribute. Again, well, they wouldn't have an excuse or that excuse anymore for not moving forward on the divestiture. So in terms of disclosure and transparency, if they really implement the new regulations, that would be good. We understand that that has started. Templates have been provided to the SOEs on how they would report their financial and non-financial performance. And we anticipate that at least 3 major economic groups will disclose their financials and non-financials by the end of 2014. I think that would be good if that happens. And then the regulations on management of state capital invested in enterprises, and also would, if they move ahead and implement it, all of this would good. I think there's a good chance that there will be progress in implementation of both of these. On corporate governance, I doubt that there will be any credible changes in the board structure of the state enterprises as we know them today. But we anticipate that they will move ahead and implement the regulations on performance-based remuneration for SOE managers. And so if your SOE is not doing as well, then what they're saying is managers will not be paid as well. It will be interesting to watch that and see what happens. The government has really also started. Are you telling? Oh, okay. Good. I still have some time to put in place a training program for board members as part of its efforts to strengthen corporate governance and management of these entities. So the story there is, in terms of actual divestitures, don't expect a big bang, but there's a good chance that all these legislations that have been put in place will begin to be implemented and generally begin a process of creating greater transparency, beginning to strengthen corporate governance and accountability. So some move in the right direction. On the banking sector, if they start implementing Circular 2 middle of the year, then really, as I said, the better classification of the bad debts, or the more accurate sense of the bad debt situation, will be a good result. The VMC plans to sell about 70 to 100 trillion dong in bad debts in 2014. I think it needs to go beyond just buying the debts to actually resolving them. And there you need to look at also issues around bankruptcy law, insolvency, and creditor rights. And again, Mark mentioned that there's some work being done on the bankruptcy law. IFC and the World Bank are both supporting the government in this area of work. And so if some of this comes into place, it provides a better framework for actual resolution of these bad debts that are being acquired by the VMC. But the VMC itself needs its capacity strengthened quite a bit. It's just really a few people, and the real questions about whether they know. They've never done this before, obviously. So some strengthening of their capacity and their governance arrangements, particularly their transparency and so on, really need to be looked at a bit more carefully. Some of the mergers and acquisitions we think will continue, but again, I don't anticipate major credible steps in this direction. On administrative reform, the last anti-corruption dialogue, I think the Vietnam the VCCI and the Vietnam Business Forum indicated that it would really be good to start anew or start afresh a process of administrative reform. And Mr. Locke, the chairman of the VCCI, did promise that he would come up with a program 12, which would be a new program of administrative reform. So, and he was very excited about it. What the presentation by the VBF participants really summarized the key things that should go into the next steps of the administrative reform. Now, if that does happen, I think that would be good. So again, that's a space that we continue to watch, and that should make all your work easier in 2014. So let me try and summarize and say, what do I think about 2014? Is it going to be just like 2013? Or is it really going to be a year of the horse? Now, as I said at the beginning, the horse is characterized by strength, by speed. Is that what we're going to see in Vietnam? And my sense is it's going to be a little more of the deja vu. So it won't be exactly 2013. As I said, and colleague speakers have said, Vietnam, the economy has bottomed out and things are going up. But it's going to be a steady going up. It's not going to be a major gallop, like horses do, or you think about when you think about horses. So there'll be a continuing upward trend, is our view. GDP growth in 2014 will be higher than 2013, but not that much higher. Perhaps in the 5.6, 5.5, thereabouts, certainly under 6. And this will happen as we hope business and consumer confidence continues to recover gradually as they see the continued stability and there's more confidence around some of what the government is doing. As I've said, we anticipate the macro will remain stable, nothing really new there. We think reform action will pick up, but again, we don't expect major acceleration, no big bang, even though we'd like to see it and would like to be surprised. Certainly not on the SOE sector, any major bang, but if they start doing some of the policy and environment things, that would really be good. And then I didn't talk much about trade integration because it's been done on the basis of principles and it's gone quite well. And there are other things, there are issues around labor, international property, that are more of the contentious issues. But Fred anticipates that by 6 months it should be concluded. So if that happens, who knows? Then all the trade integration, particularly through the TPP, could really serve as the Trojan horse that really moves Vietnam forward on some of the difficult reform issues. So you could think of the TPP in the horse and being released into the economy to fight all the difficult constraints to reform in Vietnam. So that's the likening to the horse that I see here. But it's so overall, things will continue on the up, but nothing major, nothing earth-shattering. But I think very much in Vietnamese style, continuing incremental progress. Thank you very much.